Okay, our next question as we think about interaction is how we actually coordinate our behavior with other people. And we've begun to talk about this idea, but we want to get a little bit more specific in how we actually do that. And we're going to talk in terms of the interactionist concept of self. And the idea here is that our self is an object to ourselves, just like any other object that we can identify within our environment. The self is also an object within our environment. In fact, it is the only object that is consistent in every environment that we might find ourselves. So, like any other object, we can name it. So we might use our first name to refer to the self. We can imagine it, we can visualize it, we can talk about it, we can act towards it. And the best way to imagine this is if you have ever been in a situation where you're angry with somebody and you begin to process that information in your head because you haven't confronted the individual yet. And so you have this nice internal dialogue where you can see yourself saying something, and then you can visualize the other person saying something back to you, and you go back and forth with this internal dialogue. Well, you're able to do that because yourself is an object in your own experience, and basically you're importing that self into your mind where you can begin to look at how you might respond and how the other individual might respond to what you're doing. Really, to function effectively in a group setting, we have to imagine not only the responses from the environment and others, but we also have to be aware of our own responses to alternative possible events. So if we go back to that idea of having an argument with someone, you might try 4 or 5 different scenarios. Well, if they say this, then I'm going to say that. And then you might say, but if they say this, then I'll say this. And so you're also looking at how you might respond to what might be happening within the environment. So by naming the self as well as others within our environment, we can internally represent our behavior as well as that of others. I can remember when I was in graduate school and I first started teaching, and the nights before I'd go into the class to teach, I would be awake all night, because I would be lecturing to the class all night long. And I would sit there, and they were the best lectures I've ever had in my entire life. And I could imagine myself saying particular things and the students responding, and it was just a very nice interaction with the students. However, when you get into the environment, that environment isn't exactly the same because you don't have the control over what other people within that environment are doing. But by naming ourselves and others, we can really import that social process within our minds and try out alternative scenarios as we begin to look at other people. Now, the experience of self rests on our ability to have some perspective other than our own from which to view the self as well as the situation we're in. So basically what we're saying is that in order to have a self, we have to take somebody else's perspective in terms of who we are and what we stand for. So it's almost like putting ourselves in somebody else's shoe and really looking at who we are. Now, I can remember being in graduate school, and even when I left graduate school, I continued to interact with a lot of people in the sociology department. And I'd go to this party, or all these parties, and I would interact with my major professor, the person that oversaw my dissertation research. And every time we would come into contact with one another, I would go yakety, 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 yak, and I would be talking and talking and talking. And every time I left those parties, I would say, oh, he must think I'm an idiot because all I do is talk, 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 talk. And I don't let him have a say in what in terms of the interaction. And I used to get really frustrated with that, but as we get into communication, we'll talk a little bit about this too. But basically, when I say, oh, he thought I was an idiot, that's really taking his perspective and viewing me from this perspective of this professor. So basically, we need to see ourselves from the perspective of other people. But how can we successfully adopt the perspective of the other person? How do we actually decide what the other person might think about us, or how they might view what we're doing within the environment? Most of the time, we are interacting with many people that we just meet very successfully. And we also interact with people that we're very familiar with in novel situations, where we have to rely on something other than past experience to predict their actions. So we're really asking ourselves, how can we predict what other people will do in particular situations? And we've really talked about this a little bit in terms of the information and knowledge that we use as we talked about the phases of the act, particularly the perception phase of the act. But we're able to figure out the other person's perspective because we know two things. First of all, we know who they are, and the second thing that we know is the situation. If we go back to those ideas of statuses and roles, we know that any situation that we find ourselves in, we will have knowledge of the statuses and roles contained within that situation. If we go into a fast food restaurant, for example, we know the statuses of the people that occupy that space. We have customers and workers or employees, and we know what a customer is supposed to do, and we know what an employee is supposed to do. So we would not expect in that situation that a customer is going to go up, get behind the counter, and cook their own hamburger. And it doesn't happen. So we know which status is ours, and we know which status and roles are the other person's. And we respect that as we come into these interactions. Because we have been socialized into the statuses and roles of our society, we can effectively take the perspective of the other person. And let's talk a little bit about the socialization process into the statuses and roles of our society. If we even look back to when we were younger and look at the types of games and play we did, I know that the women in the class probably could identify that they played house, they played school, and because they did this, they knew how to be a mother. They knew how to be a mother to a child and the relationship between mother and child. If you look at, I didn't play house too much, I played school, and look at where it got me. Anyway, when we look at the statuses, and I would be the teacher, we would always know what we were supposed to do, and we'd always have those bad students in the class that would always get those Fs. And it was really amazing because the bad students were always the male students in the class. So it's pretty amazing in terms of taking the perspective of the teacher. And that was based on our experience in the classroom as well, where the boys didn't seem to be doing as well as the girls in terms of their academic work. So everything that we're looking at in terms of any status that we have within our society, we know what's expected of people within those statuses, at least within a particular box. The other thing that we know is that the situation of which we are part. In other words, in every situation that we find ourselves in, we know what we are doing, we know what's expected in the situation, we know what's forbidden, we know what's typical, we know what's atypical, we know what others are doing in that situation and what we're supposed to be doing. And we know this because we have the definition of the situation. It doesn't matter if you go into my classroom or somebody else's classroom, you already know what is expected of students to do. In other words, you don't go and sit up in the front of the classroom with the teacher. I dare you to do that, because then that becomes atypical and people become uncomfortable and don't necessarily know how to react when the definition of the situation is a little bit incongruent. So at every point, every part of our activity that we're a part of, we know the situation which we find ourselves in. All of our behavior is occurring in specific, concrete, and usually well-known situations that present us with familiar acts and objects. So when we come into a classroom, it doesn't matter which classroom you go into, you're presented with familiar acts like the process of learning. You're presented with familiar objects on how to behave. So the definition of the situation is that overall understanding of the nature of a particular situation or setting. So what activities have taken place there, what seems likely to occur again, the objects that need to be taken into account, and who else is present. So this is all what we're doing in terms of looking and anticipating what we're supposed to be doing in the situation, and therefore coordinating our behavior with other people within the situation. If we think of a zoo, for example, I can begin to name a particular aspects of the zoo, like this place has a lot of animals. You see a lot of families with children. And the minute that you have a definition of the situation or an image of the situation within your head, you know what's expected within that particular situation. And people are acting on this basis of their definition of the situation. And if we begin to think about this, again, it's through our socialization process that we begin to understand what these situations mean. For example, if we look at children and we walk into the grocery store, well, young children don't realize that there's a process of paying for items before you walk out of the store. So a lot of times if you're with young children, they'll pick up things and then they don't want to let go of them to let the people scan them for the price because they don't have that concept of that being a part of the situation. They know they want that object and they just going to take it and they're not going to give it to anybody. And so through our socialization process, through interacting with our children, eventually they learn that they must let the item go through the cashier so it can be rung up. When a situation is familiar and its meaning known, we will organize our conduct and our expectations of others in relation to this definition. And if you remember that idea of substantive congruency, this is exactly what we're dealing with, that we have particular expectations based on our own definition of the situation. When we don't have a definition of what's happening, we must first establish a definition of the situation or ask ourselves what's actually going on in this particular situation. Sometimes when you think about mob situations, for example, and you get caught off guard in a particular situation, people have to first establish new rules of behavior, and if that means that we're going to go and break a bunch of windows because we're in a riot situation and other people are doing it and we want our TV too, then we will participate based on that new definition of the situation. So our actions, our behavior are based on our knowledge of the situation of which we're a part. And when we visualize this definition, we can visualize ourselves, our place in it, and we then decide what we can or should do in the situation. Again, if we begin to think about a good example of this is a few years ago with one of my global community classes, I walked into the first day of class backwards, and I put my back to the wall, or I was facing the blackboard and the students were facing my back, and I asked all the students to pick up their desk and turn them to face the back wall. Every single student in that classroom picked up their desk and turned their desk around to face the back wall. Once they did that, I turned myself around to look at the class, and so I was looking at their backs. As other students came into that classroom, those students actually picked up their desk and turned it around to face the back wall, and I did not have to ask them to do that. What's interesting here is that for whatever reason, these people thought that this was reasonable within the definition of the situation that they had. They looked at their status as students, and they looked at my status as professor, and they knew what their role was and what I was supposed to do. Now, they might have thought that it was a little bit weird that I asked them to do that, but as other students came in, they identified themselves with the other students, and therefore they did what the other students were actually doing. Without asking a question, they just did it. So when we are looking at a definition of the situation, we can anticipate the actions of others with whom we are interacting, and we can make sense of actions of others even when those actions are something that we did not anticipate. I'm sure that my students, as they entered the class, didn't expect me to ask them to turn their seats around to face the back wall, but they could make sense out of my actions. They figured I was going to use it as an example. If I continued to do that day in and day out throughout the course of the quarter, they would probably begin to wonder if I was a little bit off, and maybe eventually call Central Psych to have me committed. But we won't know that because I didn't carry it on too long after that. But the key here is that we were able to coordinate our behavior because we had some type of definition of situation, and we could begin to interact with one another based on those definitions. And again, it's knowing the statuses, it's knowing the actions that are likely to take place in this environment, and the objects and acts that are likely to take place.